Hey there everyone, and welcome to another episode of DnD Horror Story Cringe. In today's video, we hear about what happens when a DM's possible mother-in-law wants to join a session of D&D. Then we hear a tale about why communication is so important in tabletop RPGs. But before we get into the stories, here is Ziggy with a very important question.
Por favor, del me gusta, comenta y suscríbete.
Thanks, Ziggy. I hope they do. But let's get into these stories. Girlfriend's mother is invited to D&D. Suffering ensues. By Reddit user, The Nagash. I have scrolled through the horror stories of this sub for a bit, and finally decided to share my single worst D&D experience in my role-playing career. It is longer than I originally thought the tale would be, so I do hope you still enjoy it. This happened several years ago. A local game, comic book, nerd-adjacent store had it so that every Wednesday was D&D night. They had a pretty big place where we would set up tables, and the store would ask for volunteer DMs to run the games. We would get $15 in store credit per week for the service, so it wasn't nothing. This was pretty popular, with 5 to 8 fully populated, 6 to 8 player tables every week. The only rules were that you had to run official modules, and you had to allow new people to join your game if you had fewer than 8 players. This isn't vital to the story, but it's just to set the scene. And if you're curious, yes, this is actually a really terrible setting to run a game. It's extremely crowded and loud, not particularly comfortable, and you only have about 2.5 hours for your game. I had come to this event at one point to play, and ended up sticking with a table, and getting into a relationship with a woman that played at the table. We will call her Sarah. We were playing Tomb of Annihilation, and I joined this game actually as a player. While there were a few questionable events that happened during this time, it's not the focus of today's tale. I played for about 4 to 5 sessions before our DM, with no warning and very little explanation, just decided that they didn't want to run the game anymore. They actually wanted to be a player. There was no apparent replacement for DM, so I decided to step up and take over, making it my first time DMing using 5th edition in a serious game. Side note, the former DM went on to play a talking horse as his character in the game. With the preamble out of the way, we get to the meat of the story. Many months later, when we are deep into the campaign, Sarah informs me that her mother and her mother's boyfriend wanted to come by for a session and play. And Sarah said yes before asking me. Her mother and I had not gotten off on the best foot, so I didn't feel like I could face the social repercussions of putting my foot down and saying no. So I decided to just deal with it and accept their presence. The day of her inclusion comes, and it almost could not be a worse time for the mother to try and step in. The party is deep in the jungle, around a large ruined city, and they are taking part of a very big combat session. There is about 27 to 30 NPCs, 3 different factions, a ritual going on during all of it, and about 7 different initiative groups before we get to the 8 players. It's an overwhelming amount of things for me as a DM to keep track of and present in a timely and continually interesting manner. In general, so many people would come and go from these games, make it to some sessions, but not others, so the table agreed to no longer even attempt to narratively justify player entrances and exits, so people more or less would just be there or not be there sometimes. If memory serves me right, the mother made some strange frying pan cook that would heal people when she hit them with it. It's truly fuzzy, and I remember even less, because the entire fight, I am pretty sure the mother and her boyfriend hid behind a rock the entire time and did nothing. Though now for the moment of actual suffering. During the fight, Sarah, who is a druid, cast the spell Spike Growth, and for those who are not aware, the spell basically grows sharp thorns and spikes in a limited area that do damage when things attempt to walk through them. On a later turn, Sarah attempts to reposition the spell and move the spikes to a different area. Not cast the spell again, but just wants the spikes to move. The spell does not give you the ability to change the area once cast, and there's no mechanic or ability that would allow her to do this, so I do not let her. Sarah does not take this all that well, and argues with me that she should be able to, while I attempt to explain why that can't work. It was frustrating, but nothing noteworthy. That is, until her mother, that had said a grand total of maybe 50 words during the session, comes in with a vengeance and starts screaming at me. And I do mean top of her voice screaming at me about how I needed to listen to her daughter, should let it happen, and that I don't know what I'm doing. A sentence burned into my brain from the encounter is, "You have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so start fucking using them." Again, to reiterate, this isn't happening in the privacy of someone's house. This is going on in the middle of a game store with 40 other people around, all trying to play D&D, and with several effective strangers at our own table. I am thankful to say that I remained calm and only responded to her shouts in anger by trying to lower the intensity of the situation. But this went on for the better part of 5 whole minutes. Eventually, she stopped yelling, and with some difficulty, we were able to move on. But needless to say, the atmosphere was tense and the mood was killed. I have never been part of another D&D experience which caused me so much stress and anxiety in my life other than that. That whole game was a shit show, but those are stories for another time. To this day, me and the mother do not get along with each other. Shocking, I know. Yeah, I can see how that whole situation could be stressful and seared into someone's memory. Not only did OP have to deal with the chaos of running a game that is open to the public in a game store, and with what sounded like way too much happening in-game at the time, but then he had to deal with his girlfriend's mother, who he already didn't get along with, yelling at him after an argument over a spell. And by the sounds of it, OP and Sarah are still together. And if that works out, there's the prospect of marriage, in which case Sarah's mother would become OP's mother-in-law, and that would be the true horror story. Let's move on. Am I the asshole for benching a homebrew because 3/4 of the players didn't make new characters? By Reddit user, I buy Soldevi Digger. A few months ago, I was mindlessly sharing some set dressing for a one-shot that I had thought up of. Much to my surprise, my play group became extremely excited about the idea, even asking if I could expand the setting and make it into one of my usual 3-arc campaigns instead of a one-shot. I felt that there was enough to build off of, so I asked them to give me some time to put stuff to paper. Thanks to work and procrastination, it wasn't until 2 months later that I said that I was all ready. My players weren't upset about the delay though, because they kept busy starting a campaign with one of their mutual friends in a Fire Emblem setting using Fate. The day came to start making characters and possibly explain away how and why everyone knows each other. I happily explained how, thanks to some flavorful world building. All the playable 5e races, minus Warforged, were available, even a few homebrew races too. None of this ended up mattering though, because 3 out of 4 players all made, literally, their characters from the Fate campaign that they were still actively playing. Name, weapons, religion, personality, even hometowns, everything the exact same. There was a lot of bemoaning about how 5e wasn't able to handle their characters' abilities, and that it was too limiting, but we were able to iron that out without too much difficulty. I had my own hang-ups, but felt I could move past it, especially when dice started rolling. I mean, I'd let someone use a self-insert character, and this couldn't be worse. That was until the day of Session 1, where a couple of people in the group said that they were excited to start their character's Isekai spin-off. I don't know what snapped in me, but part of me just felt that if it's an Isekai they want, then it's what they'll get. I put my notes aside, and instead just ad-libbed a half-assed adaptation of what I could remember from a furry porn game I played nearly a decade ago, made PG-13 of course. My players could tell immediately that this wasn't the setting that I had talked about before, but they almost seemed nonplussed. They didn't complain, and we even had a bunch of fun. Over the last few sessions, we've had a bunch of great table moments. Though, this was until yesterday's session. After we finished talking about what we liked, didn't like, and could have done different, one of the players apologized in advance if the new player derailed the campaign. I mentioned how the module we were using was very resistant to derailment. My players all at once stopped talking and turned to me. One player finally spoke, saying, "I thought we were playing the homebrew." I, with I admit more sass than necessary, said, "If you're not going to put the effort into new characters, I'm not going to put effort into a new homebrew." This is where all the excuses and reasons started coming out. The one reason that all the players shared was that with the other GM, their characters are just names with stats, while with me, they get to actually act out their characters. I stuck to my claim that making new characters wasn't really a big ask, and that I was going to keep the current campaign unless they wanted to make new characters. It's a matter of principle. One of my players thinks I'm being an asshole, and 2 players think I'm being unreasonably difficult. They're not only not going to make new characters, but are currently planning when we'll next get together for a session, so I'm not sure how to feel. Edit. I failed to mention in my post that I did ask them repeatedly during character creation, and that I didn't really like that they were using the characters from their other campaign. I voiced my thoughts to them multiple times before session 1 even happened. They adamantly wanted those characters, so I conceded just to get things rolling. Edit 2. I accept that I am the asshole. I went too far and was too reactionary. Yeah, I think I agree with OP's last edit there. While I can understand OP feeling a bit miffed that the players didn't want to put thought into making new unique characters for OP's homebrew, at the end of the day, they are still fantasy characters for a fantasy game. As long as the players would make them fit into your world and not try to force that they are the exact same characters from the other game, I really don't see a problem with it. Though, when I asked OP if they'd mind if I shared their story, they said to wait since they were going to be posting an update. So I did, and here it is. Update. I made my original post feeling that, while petty, I was ultimately justified. I was very quickly humbled and made aware that I was at fault, not for changing the campaign last minute, but for how I managed it. By being a pushover during Session 0, I created the environment that ultimately made me frustrated in Session 1. Yesterday, the playgroup came to my house for a session, and while we were eating dinner, I apologized for my attitude at the end of the last hangout, and for jerking them around by swapping the homebrew without telling them. I reiterated my expectations for the homebrew more appropriately this time, and this is when my players started interjecting. Many words were spoken without much being said. That was until one of my players said something that made everything make sense. To paraphrase, my players didn't enter Session 0 with the intention of making their exact characters from the other campaign. Some players had loose ideas in their head, while the others wanted to see what options were available. After starting to put characters to paper though, they independently fell out of interest with those character ideas and fell back into those characters they wanted to roleplay. I believe this is because one of my players had earlier pitched a character idea to me that I really liked, but changed their mind at the end of their character creation. Me working with them, even through my complaints, only made them more excited about the prospect of playing these characters they're excited about in a setting that they're excited about. They didn't know that they had all copied their characters over until they were talking during their other GM's game night. The other GM then mentioned how it would be a cool idea if these were literally the characters from his campaign, as opposed to copies. Kind of like an anime beach episode, or spin-off OVA, where there's not a lot of story progression, but a lot of character interaction. My players actually really liked this idea, and meant to talk to me about it, but no one did. The day of Session 1 came around, and when I didn't react visually, or say anything to their talking about it, they assumed someone else in the group had talked to me. All in all, none of us communicated properly, and I handled my frustrations in an unfair way to my players. With our minds tempered, I once again expressed my requirements for the homebrew, and then laid out a few options to them that I would be okay GMing, including just putting tabletop RPGs aside for a little and playing other games. My players chose to continue our current quote-unquote module with their copied over characters until it's finished then, and if all goes well, take a second crack at starting the homebrew. Situation resolved, I suppose. I've learned that I have to be more careful about blaming other people for situations of my own creation, and that I need to work on just putting my foot down when I disagree. To answer a few questions I saw a few times in my original post. Why does the other GM use Fate if he doesn't roleplay? I don't know much about him, but from what I understand, he's an avid wargamer, and Fate is the closest thing to a setting agnostic of Crossfire, Warhammer, and XCOM that he can manage to find players for. Isn't this doubly unfair to the one player who followed your expectations? The player who knew the assignment is also the new player, who is the significant other of one of the players. This is their first experience with tabletop RPGs, and while I regret creating drama around it, they're indifferent about the situation. They're even a little annoyed at their significant other, because apparently they've been trying to make them play a copy of their 5e character in the other GM's Fate campaign. Do your players know that you're adapting from a porn game? This question was never directly asked, but I saw the spirit of it pop up a few times. No, they don't. They just think it's a module they never heard of. Do your players think that all modules are lazy? This question was also never asked in that wording, but I felt some posts read this way. They don't think modules are lazy, just that anyone can run them, and that if that's the kind of gameplay they wanted, they just go to a pickup group at a local game store. So, it looks like it all boils down to a lack of communication. Thankfully, it sounds like when OP actually decided to do some introspection and talk to everyone, everything seems to be working out. Though, I would still say that OP should tell the players that their character builds are fine, but to not have it be canon that those characters are the exact same ones from that other GM's game. Hopefully, everything continues to work out, and they all can eventually play the homebrew that OP worked so hard on. Godspeed to all of you. And that's all the time we have for today. If you have a story that you would like to be read in a video, be sure to post it to the D&D Doge subreddit. And if you want more of the like and comment kitties, be sure to follow me on Twitter. As always, I appreciate all of you, and may all of your rolls be natural 20s. Until next time.